Some men return from war as heroes, but Leif Oxenhart came home as a stranger to his own soul. For 3 years, the great Viking warrior lived alone in Hrafndal, respected but avoided, fixing fences and training boys, while his heart grew colder than the northern winds. Then one day, a bold maiden named Thyri asked him a simple question that changed everything. You want wife or lonely life? What started as shared chores and quiet walks became something deeper than any battle he'd ever fought. But when his old commander arrived with promises of glory and gold, Leif faced his hardest choice yet. Would he choose the war that made him famous or the love that made him whole? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the memories that haunted Leif Oxenhart's sleep. He rose before dawn, as he had every day for the past 3 years, moving through his modest wooden home with the quiet precision of a man who had learned to live with ghosts. Above his stone hearth hung a magnificent war axe, its blade still sharp enough to split a hair, its handle worn smooth by countless battles. He never touched it anymore. The village of Hrafndal stirred slowly to life around him. Smoke began to curl from chimneys, and the sound of children's laughter drifted through his shuttered windows like a song he'd forgotten how to sing. Leif pulled on his simple wool tunic and leather boots, the kind any farmer might wear, though the muscles beneath the fabric told a different story. His hands, scarred and calloused, had once wielded that axe with deadly grace. Now they mended fences and tended to broken cart wheels. He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, breathing deeply of the salt and pine that marked his homeland. The village spread before him like a tapestry of ordinary life, thatched roofs heavy, with morning dew, gardens bursting with late summer vegetables, and the distant sound of hammers ringing from the blacksmith's forge. It was peaceful. It was safe. It was everything he'd once fought to protect, and yet he felt like a stranger in its midst. Morning, Leif. Old Henrik raised a weathered hand from his doorway, the greeting respectful but distant, always distant. The baker's wife, Astrid, hurried past with her arms full of fresh loaves, offering a quick nod but avoiding his eyes. A group of children playing with wooden swords fell silent as he walked by, their games forgotten in the presence of a real warrior. This was his life, now respected, feared, and utterly alone. Leif made his way to the training ground at the village's edge, where a handful of young men waited with eager faces and trembling hands. They came to him because their fathers remembered his name, whispered in reverence around winter fires. Leif the mighty, Leif the bone crusher. Leif, who had stood with Earl Magnus against the Saxon raiders and lived to tell the tale. But the man who faced these boys each morning bore little resemblance to those legends. "Form ranks," he said quietly, and they scrambled to obey. He moved among them like a shadow, adjusting stances, correcting grips, teaching them to hold a shield as if their lives depended on it. Because someday it might. Remember, he told young Bjorn, a blacksmith's son, with more enthusiasm than skill, the sword is only as good as the man who wields it. Strength without wisdom is just noise. The boy nodded solemnly, though Leif wondered if he truly understood. How could he? These boys had never felt the weight of a dying friend in their arms, never watched good men fall because someone made a mistake in the heat of battle. The training session lasted until the sun climbed high enough to burn away the morning mist. As the young warriors dispersed, chattering about technique and planning their evening adventures, Leif found himself alone once more. It was then that Magnus Ironbeard approached, his grey braids dancing in the sea breeze. Magnus was one of the few men in Hrafndal who remembered Leif from before the wars, when he'd been just another ambitious young warrior with dreams of glory and gold. Now Magnus served as the village's unofficial leader, a role that suited his diplomatic nature far better than battle ever had. "The boys are improving," Magnus observed, settling beside Leif on a moss-covered stone. Young Bjorn almost managed to keep his shield up for the entire drill. Leif grunted, watching the last of his students disappear into the village. Almost isn't good enough. If raiders come, raiders won't come, Leif. Magnus's voice was gentle but firm. The wars are over, the treaties hold. These boys are more likely to need their swords for harvest festivals than actual combat. The comment hung between them like a challenge. Leif had heard it before, from Magnus and others. The world had moved on. Peace was possible. Men could lay down their swords and pick up plows without shame. But for Leif, peace felt like a foreign language he'd never learned to speak. Earl Gunnar is hosting another feast tomorrow night, Magnus continued, his tone carefully casual. The whole village is invited. There'll be roasted boar, fresh ale, storytelling. You should come. Leif had attended exactly one feast since his return to Hrafndal. He'd sat in the back, nursed a single cup of ale, and left before the singing began. The laughter had felt too loud, the stories too simple, the company too innocent for a man who carried the weight of too many battles in his bones. I have work to do, Leif replied, the same excuse he always gave. Magnus sighed, a sound heavy with years of friendship and concern. Leif, you can't live like this forever. You're 32 winters old, not 90. You have decades ahead of you. What will you do with them? Mend fences until you die? The question struck deeper than Magnus probably intended. What would he do? Leif had spent so many years focused on survival, on the next battle, the next campaign, that he'd never considered what came after. Peace had found him unprepared, like an enemy attacking from an unexpected direction. I'm content, Leif said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. No, Magnus replied softly. You're hiding. After Magnus left, Leif walked the village's perimeter, a habit he'd developed without conscious thought. He told himself he was checking for signs of trouble, but the truth was simpler and more painful. He didn't know how else to spend his time. The fence he'd been mending for the past week stretched along the eastern border of Hrafndal, separating the village proper from the wild meadows where sheep grazed in summer. The work was simple, methodical, and solitary. Perfect for a man who'd forgotten how to be around people without expecting them to die. He selected a loose post, tested its stability, and began to dig. The rhythm of the work was soothing: lift, dig, tamp, repeat. His mind wandered to memories of other fences, other boundaries, other times when a strong back and steady hands were all that stood between order and chaos. He'd been working for perhaps an hour when he heard footsteps approaching through the grass. Leif didn't look up immediately, assuming it was one of his young students returning with a forgotten question, or Magnus coming back to continue their interrupted conversation. But these footsteps were different, lighter, more purposeful, with a confident rhythm that spoke of someone comfortable in their own skin. You're the one they call Leif Oxenhart, said a voice he'd never heard before, warm with amusement and completely free of the nervous respect he usually heard in his name. He straightened slowly, wiping dirt from his hands as he turned to face the speaker. What he saw made him pause in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition, not of her face, which was new to him, but of something in her bearing that reminded him of warriors he'd known, confident ones, dangerous ones, alive ones. She was perhaps 25 winters, with auburn hair braided in the practical style of a working woman and green eyes that seemed to hold secrets worth keeping. Her dress was simple but well made, and she carried herself with the easy grace of someone accustomed to being exactly where she belonged. But it was her expression that caught his attention, curious, direct, and completely unafraid. I am, he replied, his voice rougher than he'd intended after hours of silence. She nodded, studying him with the same intensity he'd once reserved for enemy formations. I'm Thyri, Sven the merchant's daughter. I've been in Hrafndal for 3 days now, and everyone has a story about you. Leif felt his jaw tighten. He could imagine those stories, some true, some exaggerated, all of them. painting him as either a hero or a madman. Neither version felt like the truth. Do they? Oh, yes. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. You killed 50 men in a single battle. You once ate an entire roasted ox by yourself. You can split a tree with your bare hands. You talk to wolves. She paused, tilting her head. That last one seemed unlikely, but old Runa swore it was true. Despite himself, Leif felt his mouth twitch toward something that might have been a smile. Runa has been known to see things that aren't there. So you don't talk to wolves? No. Disappointing. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the herbs she'd used to wash her hair. Lavender and mint, scents that belonged to a world far gentler than the one he'd known. What about the tree splitting? Also no. The roasted ox? I've never been that hungry. 50 men in a single battle? The question hung between them, and Leif felt the familiar weight of memory pressing against his chest. The battle at Ravenshollow, the mud and the screaming and the terrible mathematics of survival. He'd never counted the bodies afterward, there hadn't been time, and the number wouldn't have brought back the friends who'd fallen beside him. Numbers don't matter, he said finally. Dead is dead. Thyri studied his face for a long moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she could see more than he wanted to show. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its playful edge. You know what I think, she said, leaning against the fence post he'd been working on. I think you're tired of being a story. I think you want to be a person again, but you've forgotten how. The words hit him like a physical blow, more accurate than any weapon he'd ever faced. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there, while a stranger's insight tore through defenses he'd spent years building. I think, she continued, her voice gentle now, that you've been alone so long you've started to believe it's what you deserve. Leif turned away, ostensibly to resume his work, but really to escape those knowing green eyes. You don't know anything about me. Maybe not, she agreed easily. But I know loneliness when I see it. And I know that mending fences is a poor substitute for mending a life. He drove the spade into the ground harder than necessary, anger flaring in his chest. What right did this stranger have to come here, to look at him and see so much, to speak truths he'd spent 3 years trying to avoid? Why are you here? He asked, not looking at her. In Hrafndal? My father has business with your shipbuilders. We'll be here another week, maybe 2. No, he said, finally meeting her eyes. Why are you here? Talking to me. Everyone else in this village gives me a wide path. Thyri was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a note of sadness that made him look at her more carefully. Because, she said, I recognize the look of someone who's forgotten they're worth knowing. 3 days passed before Leif saw Thyri again. He told himself he wasn't looking for her as he went about his daily routines, but his eyes kept searching the marketplace, the well, the paths between houses. Her words had lodged in his mind like a splinter, impossible to ignore and painful to touch. He was splitting wood behind his house when she appeared again, emerging from the tree line like a forest spirit. This time she carried a basket filled with herbs and wild berries, her skirts stained with morning dew. Good morning, she said, settling herself on a stump as if she'd been invited. I've been exploring your woods, they're beautiful. Leif buried his axe in the chopping block and wiped sweat from his brow. The physical work helped quiet his mind, but her presence brought back that unsettling awareness he'd been trying to forget. Most people stay closer to the village, he said. Most people don't know how to read the signs that keep you safe in wild places. She pulled a handful of berries from her basket and offered them to him. My mother taught me. She was raised by the forest folk before she married my father. He hesitated, then took the berries. They were sweet and warm from the sun, and he realized he hadn't eaten since dawn. Forest folk? The old ways. Herb lore, weather signs, how to move without disturbing the natural order. Thyri's voice carried reverence. She said the land speaks to those who know how to listen. Leif found himself genuinely curious for the first time in months. And you hear it? Sometimes. She smiled, and it transformed her face completely. This morning it told me that the stubborn warrior who lives at the edge of things might be hungry. Despite himself, Leif felt something ease in his chest. The land told you that? Well, that and the fact that I've watched you work for 3 hours without stopping to eat. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. I may listen to the forest, but I'm not blind to more obvious signs. They shared the berries in comfortable silence, and Leif found himself studying her profile as she looked out toward the fjord. There was something deeply peaceful about her presence, as if she carried stillness within herself that couldn't be disturbed by external storms. "Can I ask you something?" she said eventually. Leif tensed, expecting another probing question about his past. "What? Why did you come back here? To Hrafndal, I mean. You could have gone anywhere after the wars ended." The question surprised him with its simplicity. He'd expected her to ask about battles or scars or the nightmares that still woke him most nights. Instead, she wanted to know about choice. "This is home," he said finally. "Is it?" She turned to face him fully. "Or is it just familiar?" Before he could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the meadow. Leif's warrior instincts kicked in immediately too. Fast for a casual traveler, too purposeful for a merchant. He rose to his feet, his hand moving unconsciously to where his sword would have hung. A lone rider emerged from the forest path, pushing his horse hard. As he drew closer, Leif felt his blood turn cold. The man wore the colors of Earl Magnus's warband, the same blues and silver that Leif had once worn with pride. But it was the rider's face that made Leif's chest tighten with dread. Ragnar Bloodaxe, his former shield brother, his closest friend, the man who'd saved his life at Stamford Bridge and nearly died doing it. Ragnar pulled his horse to a halt before them, his weathered face grim with purpose. 3 years had aged him more than the 5 before that. New scars crossed his arms, and his beard showed streaks of premature grey. But his eyes still held the fierce intelligence that had made him Earl Magnus's most trusted lieutenant. "Leif," Ragnar said, dismounting in one fluid motion. "I need to speak with you." Thyri rose gracefully, understanding without words that this was not a conversation for her ears. "I should return to the village," she said softly. As she passed Leif, she touched his arm briefly. "Whatever this is about, remember that you have a choice." Leif watched her go, then turned to face the man who'd once been closer than a brother. "Ragnar, it's been too long." Ragnar clasped his shoulder, and Leif felt the familiar weight of old friendship and older obligations. "You look well, peaceful. What do you want?" Ragnar's expression grew serious. "Earl Magnus is dead." The words hit Leif like a physical blow. Earl Magnus the Great, who'd united 3 clans under his banner and held the northern territories against Saxon expansion for 15 years. The man who'd been both commander and father figure to dozens of warriors, including Leif himself. "How?" Leif's voice came out rougher than intended. "Fever took him last month. Quick and clean, a better death than most of us will see." Ragnar's jaw tightened, but his passing has created problems. His son, Eric, claims the inheritance, but the other clan leaders question his right. The northern territories are fragmenting. Leif felt a familiar coldness creeping up his spine. He'd seen this before, strong leadership dying, weak men grasping for power, old alliances crumbling into petty feuds. It always ended the same way, in blood. "The council has offered me the position of war chief," Ragnar continued, "to hold the territories together until Eric can prove himself or someone stronger emerges." "Congratulations," Leif said flatly. "I want you as my second. My sword arm and tactical mind, like old times." Ragnar stepped closer, his voice dropping to the intensity Leif remembered from their warrior days. "The threats are real, Leif. Saxon raiders are already testing our borders, and there are rumors of Danish longships massing in the southern islands. Without strong leadership, everything Magnus built will fall apart. Leif shook his head slowly. I'm done with that life. Are you? Ragnar gestured toward the village. Is this really living, Leif? Hiding in a farming village, mending fences and training boys who'll never see real combat? You're one of the greatest tactical minds of our generation, wasting away in peaceful obscurity. I'm content. You're dying by inches. Ragnar's voice turned sharp with frustration. I've watched strong men rot in peace before. They tell themselves they're content, while their souls shrivel like unused muscles. Is that what you want to become, a cautionary tale about warriors who outlived their purpose? The accusation stung because it echoed thoughts Leif had been trying to suppress for months. What was he, really, without the structure of military life, without clear enemies to fight and objectives to achieve? Was he a man at peace, or simply a warrior without a war? Think about what's at stake, Ragnar pressed. Not just territory or politics, but the people who depend on strong leadership. Without the Northern Alliance, every village like this one becomes vulnerable. Every farm, every family, every peaceful life becomes a target for raiders and ambitious warlords. Leif's eyes drifted toward the village, where smoke rose peacefully from cottage chimneys and children played in carefully tended gardens. Somewhere among those houses, Thyri was probably helping her father with his business, unaware that her world might be balanced on the edge of a blade. I need an answer soon, Ragnar said quietly. The council meets at the new moon 6 days from now. If you come with me, you'll be granted lands, title, a place of honor at my side. You'll matter again, Leif. You'll be what you were meant to be. And if I refuse? Ragnar's expression grew sad. Then I'll remember my friend as he was, not as he chose to become. After Ragnar left, Leif sat alone among the wood shavings and tried to sort through the storm in his mind. 6 days. 6 days to decide between the life he'd built and the life that was calling him back. 6 days to choose between safety and purpose, peace and meaning, the unknown possibility of love and the familiar certainty of war. He thought about Thyri's words. Remember that you have a choice. But did he really? Or was he simply a weapon that had been set aside temporarily, waiting for the day when someone would inevitably pick him up again? The sun was setting by the time he finally rose from the stump where Thyri had sat that morning. As he gathered the scattered wood and prepared to return to his empty house, one question echoed in his mind, like a battle horn calling him to assembly. What did it mean to choose a life worth living? That evening, Leif found himself walking toward the village center without conscious decision. His feet carried him past the familiar cottages and workshops, while his mind churned with Ragnar's words. The weight of choice pressed against his shoulders like armor he'd forgotten how to remove. The tavern's warm glow spilled through its open door, and for a moment he considered entering. Perhaps ale would quiet the voices in his head, Ragnar's urgent summons, Magnus's remembered wisdom, his own doubts circling like carrion birds. But the sound of laughter from within stopped him. He'd lost the knack for companionship, if he'd ever truly possessed it. Instead, he found himself at the village well, where a single figure sat on the stone rim, gazing up at the emerging stars. Thyri looked ethereal in the moonlight, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders, her face serene with the kind of peace he'd forgotten was possible. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, without looking at him. Leif settled beside her, careful to maintain distance while craving closeness. "How did you know it was me? You walk like a man carrying the weight of the world." Heavy footsteps, measured pace. She finally turned to him, her green eyes reflecting starlight. "Also, you're the only person in Hrafndal who moves that quietly while still making noise." Despite everything, he almost smiled. "Is that supposed to make sense? You're trained to move without sound, but you're choosing to make noise so people know you're coming." Consideration disguised as carelessness. Her observation struck him as uncomfortably accurate. "The question is whether you're being courteous or giving yourself away because part of you wants to be found. The insight made him shift uncomfortably. You see too much, or you hide too little. She pulled her cloak tighter against the evening chill. Your friend seemed troubled when he left. Leif studied her profile, wondering how much she'd observed. He brought news from the outside world, the kind of news that makes a peaceful man question his choices. He nodded slowly. Earl Magnus is dead. The Northern Territories need leadership, and they want you. It wasn't a question. Thyri had a gift for reading the currents beneath surface conversations, and Leif found it both comforting and unsettling. No one had understood him this quickly since. Never, he realized with surprise. They want the man I used to be, he corrected. The weapon I used to be. Is there a difference? The question hung between them like morning mist, beautiful and insubstantial. Leif considered it seriously, trying to untangle the threads of identity and purpose that had become so snarled in his mind. I don't know anymore, he admitted. For 15 years I was Leif the warrior. I knew exactly who I was and what I was meant to do. Every morning brought clear objectives: protect my men, serve my lord, defeat the enemy. Simple, clean. And now, I'm just a man who used to be good at killing people. The words tasted bitter. What use is that in a world at peace? Thyri was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a sadness he hadn't expected. My father was a warrior once, before he became a merchant. He fought in the Irish campaigns when I was small. Leif turned to look at her fully. This was the first time she'd spoken of personal history, and he found himself hungry for the details of her life. He came home different, she continued, quieter, more careful with his words and his touch. My mother said it was like living with a stranger who wore her husband's face. Did he? Leif stopped, unsure if he wanted to know the answer. Did he find his way back? Eventually, but not by trying to become who he was before. That man was gone, carved away by experiences that couldn't be undone. Instead, he had to discover who he could become. She smiled softly. It took time, and patience, and the willingness to believe that a warrior's strength might serve different purposes than war. Leif felt something stir in his chest, hope, perhaps, or simply the recognition that someone else had walked this path before him. What changed for him? He learned to see his protective instincts as love instead of violence. His strategic mind became useful for trade routes and negotiations. His leadership skills helped him build relationships with craftsmen and suppliers. Thyri's eyes grew thoughtful. Most importantly, he stopped seeing peace as the absence of purpose and started seeing it as the presence of choice. Choice, Leif repeated, remembering her words from the morning. The freedom to decide who you want to become instead of who you're expected to be. She stood gracefully, brushing dust from her skirts. Your friend offered you a return to certainty. I understand the appeal. But, running back to what you know isn't the same as moving forward to what you could become. Her hand touched his shoulder briefly, a whisper of warmth that made him acutely aware of how long it had been since anyone had offered him comfort. The question isn't whether you're still a warrior, Leif. It's whether being a warrior is still enough for you. After she left, Leif remained by the well until the stars wheeled overhead and the village settled into sleep. Her words echoed in the darkness, challenging assumptions he'd held for so long they'd become part of his identity. Was being a warrior enough? Had it ever been enough, or had he simply never allowed himself to imagine alternatives? He thought about the men he'd known who'd found peace after war. Some, like Thyri's father, had built new lives around old skills. Others had retreated into drink or madness or the bitter isolation that came from believing their best days were behind them. A few had returned to war again and again, chasing the clarity that only combat could provide. Which path would he choose? The next morning brought rain, a steady drizzle that turned the village paths to mud and drove everyone indoors. Leif spent the day in his workshop, a small building behind his house where he repaired weapons and tools for the villagers. The work was meditative, straightening bent sword blades, sharpening dulled axes, replacing worn leather grips. Each piece told a story of use and neglect, of tools that had served their purpose and been set aside when peace made them unnecessary. Like him, around midday, young Bjorn appeared at his door, shaking rain from his cloak and carrying a damaged practice sword. "Master Leif, my father sent me." The blade cracked during morning drills, and he thought, "Bring it here," Leif interrupted, gesturing the boy inside. The sword was beyond simple repair. The metal had developed stress fractures that made it dangerous to use. Leif examined it carefully, noting the places where poor technique had weakened the blade over time. "This can't be fixed," he told Bjorn. "The damage goes too deep. You'll need a new practice sword." The boy's face fell. "Father won't be pleased. We can't afford." "I'll make you one," Leif said before he could stop himself. "A proper one, forged to last." Bjorn's eyes widened with surprise and gratitude. "You would do that? But what payment?" "No payment." Leif turned back to his workbench, suddenly uncomfortable with the boy's obvious appreciation. "Consider it an investment in your training." As Bjorn left, practically glowing with excitement, Leif found himself wondering when he'd last felt the satisfaction of building something instead of destroying it. The thought stayed with him as he began sketching designs for the practice sword, his mind already calculating angles and proportions. Perhaps Thyri was right. Perhaps strength could serve purposes other than war. But 6 days remained until Ragnar's deadline, and the weight of choice grew heavier with each passing hour. The next 3 days blurred together in a rhythm of work and contemplation. Leif threw himself into forging Bjorn's practice sword, finding unexpected solace in the ancient dance of fire and metal. Each strike of his hammer seemed to clarify his thoughts, though the clarity itself remained frustratingly elusive. Thyri appeared on the second day, arriving with fresh bread and honey while he worked. She didn't speak of Ragnar's visit or the choice hanging over him like a storm cloud. Instead, she asked about metalworking, genuinely curious about the process of transforming raw iron into something useful and beautiful. "My father trades in finished goods," she explained, watching him shape the blade's tang. "But I've never seen the creation, only the result. It's like watching magic." "No magic," Leif replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "Just understanding what the metal wants to become and helping it get there." "Is that wisdom or philosophy?" He paused, considering the question. "Both, maybe. A good smith learns to work with the material's nature instead of fighting it. Force too much, too fast, and you create weakness. Be too gentle, and you achieve nothing." Thyri smiled, settling herself on a low stool where she could watch him work. "Sounds like advice for more than metalworking." "Everything worth doing requires patience and persistence," he said, returning to his hammering. The rhythm was hypnotic, each blow ringing clear and true in the small space. "My first weapons master taught me that. Leif," he'd say, "a sword forged in haste will break when you need it most. But a blade made with care will serve you until your dying day." "Did you make your war axe?" The question made him pause mid-strike. "Yes, during my second winter as Earl Magnus's man, took me 3 months to get it right." "Why don't you use it anymore?" Leif set down his hammer, studying the glowing metal before him. The question touched the heart of his struggle, the place where past and future intersected in painful confusion. "Because that axe was made for a specific purpose," he said finally. "It was designed to end lives efficiently. Every curve of the handle, every angle of the dodger, blade, all of it focused on killing." He met her eyes. "A tool like that carries the weight of its purpose. When I pick it up, I become the man who made it, the man who used it." And you don't want to be that man anymore? I don't know if I have a choice. Thyri rose and moved closer, close enough that he could smell the herbs in her hair and see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. What if I told you that the man I've come to know these past few days, the one who teaches boys with patience, who offers to forge weapons without payment, who chooses his words carefully and treats even strangers with respect, what if I told you that man seems worth choosing? Her words hit him with unexpected force. When had anyone last seen him as something other than a collection of battle skills and violent potential? When had anyone looked at him and seen possibility instead of history? You barely know me, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I know enough. She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cool against his heated skin. I know you rise before dawn to avoid disturbing your neighbors. I know you've never raised your voice to the boys you train, even when they make dangerous mistakes. I know you fixed old Henrik's gate last week without being asked and pretended it wasn't you when he tried to thank you. Leif stared at her, caught between surprise and something deeper that he didn't dare name. How do you? Small villages have few secrets, she said gently, especially about the man everyone watches but no one talks to directly. That evening, Leif found himself walking through the village with new awareness. Had he really been so transparent? As he passed Henrik's gate, indeed perfectly repaired and functioning smoothly, he wondered what other small kindnesses had marked him as clearly as battle scars. At the tavern, he glimpsed through the window as Magnus Ironbeard gestured animatedly while telling a story to a gathered crowd. The older man caught sight of him and raised his ale cup in a subtle toast. How long had it been since he'd joined those evening gatherings? How many invitations had he declined out of habit rather than genuine preference? Near the blacksmith's forge, he encountered Bjorn's father, Eric Hammerhand, banking the day's coals for the night. "Master Leif," Eric called out, straightening from his work. "Bjorn tells me you're making him a practice sword. I want you to know we're grateful, but we can pay. Maybe not in silver, but in trade. Fresh horseshoes for your mount, repairs to your tools." "No payment necessary," Leif interrupted, then stopped himself. Why was he so quick to refuse connection, even the simple bond of fair exchange? "Though, if you have spare iron stock, I could use some for future projects." Eric's face brightened. "Of course. I've got good metal from the southern mines. Take what you need." As they arranged the trade, Leif realized he was planning for future projects he hadn't even conceived yet. When had he started thinking beyond the immediate choice Ragnar had presented? When had tomorrow started extending further than 6 days? The third day brought Sven the merchant to his workshop, Thyri's father proving to be a sturdy man with shrewd eyes and calloused hands that spoke of work beyond mere trading. He examined the practice sword with professional interest. "Fine work," Sven declared, testing the blade's balance. "Better than what I've seen in the coastal cities. You could sell pieces like this if you had a mind to." "I'm not a smith by trade," Leif replied. "No, but you could be." Sven set down the sword and fixed Leif with a direct stare. "I deal with craftsmen across 3 kingdoms. Good metalwork always finds buyers, especially pieces made by someone who understands how they'll be used. Weapons, tools, decorative work, there's a market for all of it." "You're suggesting I become a merchant?" Sven laughed, the sound warm and uncomplicated. "I'm suggesting you consider what skills you have beyond swinging an axe. My daughter tells me you've been asking yourself hard questions lately. Sometimes the answer isn't choosing between old paths, sometimes it's making a new one." That night, Leif sat in his workshop long after the forge had cooled, Bjorn's completed practice sword across his knees. It was, he had to admit, the finest weapon he'd ever made, perfectly balanced, elegantly proportioned, built to teach rather than kill. As he held it, he tried to imagine a future where his hands created instead of destroyed, where his knowledge of combat served to protect rather than conquer. 3 days remained until Ragnar's deadline. 3 days to decide whether the man Thyri saw in him was real or simply wishful thinking. 3 days to choose between the warrior he'd always been and the person he might become. The morning of the 4th day brought news that changed everything. Young Bjorn arrived at Leif's workshop at dawn, breathless and wide-eyed with excitement. "Master Leif, there's been a fight." Well, not a real fight, but almost one. At the harbour. Leif set down the file he'd been using to put finishing touches on the practice sword. "Slow down. What happened? Raiders? Or maybe just rough traders, but they looked like raiders. 3 ships with maybe 40 men, demanding dock rights and acting like they owned the place." Bjorn's words tumbled over each other. Magnus Ironbeard went to meet them with some of the village men, but the strangers laughed at him. Said Hrafndal was under new protection now, and they'd be collecting taxes for safe passage. A cold knot formed in Leif's stomach. This was how it always began, small incursions, testing defenses, probing for weakness. If these men were allowed to establish a foothold here, more would follow. "Where are they now?" "Still at the harbour. Magnus sent me to find you." He says. Bjorn hesitated, clearly struggling with sectet. The adult complexities of the message. He says maybe it's time for old skills to serve new purposes. Leif was already reaching for his cloak. The practice sword could wait. This required immediate attention. The harbour was in chaos when he arrived. 3 sleek warships bobbed at anchor, their dragon-head prows carved in the style favoured by the Danish raiders. On the dock, a cluster of Hrafndal villagers faced off against roughly a dozen armed strangers, while Magnus Ironbeard attempted to negotiate from a position of obvious weakness. The leader of the strangers was a tall man with ritual scars covering his arms and a voice that carried the arrogant confidence of someone accustomed to taking what he wanted. He wore fine mail and carried himself like a professional warrior, though his men seemed more like sellswords than true battle-tested veterans. "Telling you again, old man," the leader was saying as Leif approached. "New times call for new arrangements. Earl Magnus is dead, the northern territories are fragmenting, and smart villages make accommodations with those strong enough to protect them. Hrafndal has managed its own protection for generations." Magnus replied with dignity, though Leif could see the strain in his shoulders. The village leader was a diplomat, not a warrior, and he was badly overmatched in this confrontation. "Have you?" The stranger gestured toward the modest fishing boats and merchant vessels that comprised Hrafndal's fleet. "I see no warships, no professional soldiers, just farmers and fishermen playing at self-defense." His tone turned mocking. "What happens when real raiders come? Men who aren't interested in negotiation?" It was then that the stranger's eyes fell on Leif, and everything changed. The raider's expression shifted from casual arrogance to sharp attention, the way a wolf might react to discovering it had wandered into another predator's territory. "Well," the stranger said slowly, "this is interesting." Magnus turned and saw Leif approaching, relief and apprehension warring in his weathered features. "This is Leif Oxenhart," he announced, his voice carrying new confidence. "Perhaps you've heard the name." The reaction was immediate and telling. Several of the raiders stepped back instinctively, hands moving toward weapons before their leader gestured for calm. The scarred man studied Leif with the focused attention of a professional assessing potential threat. "Leif the Mighty," he said finally. "Bone Crusher, the ghost of Ravenshollow." A slow smile spread across his face. "I wondered what had happened to you. The stories said you disappeared after Earl Magnus's last campaign." "Stories exaggerate," Leif replied evenly, though he positioned himself where he could see all the raiders while keeping the villagers behind him. "Old habits." "Do they?" The leader's hand rested casually on his sword hilt. 3 years ago, my cousin Thorvald Bloodbeard led a raid against a northern rand settlement. 40 good men, all veterans. Only 5 came back, and they were broken things, talking about a demon in human form who fought like the gods themselves. Leif remembered the raid. It had been one of the last actions before Earl Magnus's death, a punitive expedition against persistent raiders who'd been terrorizing coastal villages. The memory brought no satisfaction, only the familiar weight of necessary violence. "Your cousin should have chosen better targets," Leif said. "Perhaps. But here's what interests me. If the great Leif Oxenhart has truly retired to this peaceful little village, why isn't he wearing a sword today?" The question hung in the salt air like a challenge. Every eye was fixed on Leif's empty sword belt, and he could feel the tension radiating from both sides of the confrontation. The raiders were calculating odds, wondering if legend matched reality. The villagers were looking to him for protection he wasn't sure he could provide without becoming the very thing he'd tried to leave behind. "Because," Leif said carefully, "a wise man only draws steel when words have failed completely." "And have they? Failed, I mean?" The stranger's smile turned predatory. "Because my original offer stands. Protection for tribute, safety for submission. Your people can keep their peaceful lives, and we ensure that real threats never reach their shores." "Protection from whom?" Leif stepped closer and was satisfied to see several raiders shift nervously. "From you? From the chaos that's coming?" the leader replied, his casual demeanor slipping to reveal genuine conviction beneath. "You know it as well as I do. With Earl Magnus dead and the northern territories fracturing, every ambitious warlord and landless clan will be looking for easy pickings. Village like this prosperous, undefended, isolated, they're irresistible targets." The worst part was that the man was probably right. Leif had seen it happen before, during periods of political instability. Strong leadership died, alliances crumbled, and suddenly every settlement had to choose between paying protection money or facing the consequences of independence. "And you're offering to be our protector out of pure generosity?" Magnus asked, his diplomat's instincts allowing him to find his voice again. "I'm offering to be predictable," the raider corrected. "Better the tribute you know than the raid you don't. We take a tithe of your goods and trade, and in return, no one burns your village or carries off your daughters. Simple, clean, mutually beneficial." Leif felt the familiar battle calculations running through his mind: numbers, weapons, terrain, escape routes. 12 armed men against a village of perhaps 300 souls, most of them non-combatants. But there were 30 more raiders on the ships, and this was clearly just the advance party. "How long do we have to consider your generous offer?" he asked. "Until tomorrow's dawn. After that, we assume Hrafndal prefers the uncertain path of independence." The stranger's smile returned. "Of course, if the great Leif Oxenhart chose to rejoin the game, that would change the calculations considerably. A man of your reputation could find a place in my organization. Better than rotting away in peaceful obscurity." As the raiders returned to their ships, Leif found himself surrounded by worried villagers, all asking the same questions. What would they do? Could the village defend itself? Would he help them? Looking into their frightened faces, Leif realized that Ragnar's deadline had become irrelevant. The choice was no longer between returning to war or embracing peace. The choice was between the people he'd sworn to protect and the man he'd tried to become. The emergency council meeting that evening filled Magnus Ironbeard's hall to capacity. Every family had sent representatives, and the air thrummed with fear, anger, and desperate hope. Leif sat in the back, watching faces. He'd come to know over 3 years of quiet coexistence, seeing them transformed by the prospect of violence. "We should send word to the coastal settlements," suggested Eric Hammerhand. "Form an alliance, pool our defenses. The nearest garrison is 3 days' ride," countered Astrid the baker. "By the time help arrives, we'll all be dead, or worse." "Maybe we should consider their offer," whispered old Runa, her voice barely audible above the worried murmur. "Tribute is better than destruction." "Tribute today, slavery tomorrow," Magnus replied grimly. "I've seen how these arrangements develop. First they want goods, then they want labor, then they want everything. There's no appeasing wolves by feeding them." Leif listened to the debate with growing unease. These were good people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, but they had no experience with the kind of predators now threatening their home. Their courage was admirable, but courage without knowledge was just another word for suicide. What about you, Leif? Magnus's voice cut through the discussion. You've been silent. What do you think we should do? All eyes turned to him, and Leif felt the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force. They wanted him to be the solution to their problem, to transform back into the legendary warrior who could solve everything with steel and skill. But he'd spent 3 years learning that some problems couldn't be solved by violence, that every sword stroke carried consequences beyond the immediate target. I think, he said slowly, that you're asking the wrong questions. The hall fell silent. Magnus raised an eyebrow, encouraging him to continue. You're debating whether to fight or submit, but you're not considering why they chose Hrafndal. Leif rose to his feet, moving to the center of the room where everyone could see him. 12 men don't threaten a village of 300 without good reason. They know something we don't. What do you mean? Asked Sven the merchant, Thyri's father. Think about it. Of all the coastal settlements, why here? Why now? Leif's mind worked through the tactical implications. Hrafndal has a defensible harbour, good freshwater access, and established trade routes. More importantly, it's isolated enough that they could establish control without immediate interference from larger powers. Magnus's expression grew thoughtful. You're suggesting this isn't random raiding. I'm suggesting this is the beginning of something larger. They're not just looking for tribute, they're looking for a base of operations. Leif let that sink in before continuing. Which means running or surrendering won't solve the problem. It will just delay the inevitable while making them stronger. So we fight. Young Bjorn's voice cracked with nervous excitement. If necessary, Leif replied. But fighting smart, not hard. 40 trained warriors against untrained villagers is slaughter, not battle. We need to change the terms of engagement. How? Magnus leaned forward, his diplomat's mind clearly working on the problem. Leif was quiet for a long moment, memories of old campaigns and forgotten strategies surfacing like buried treasure. When he spoke, his voice carried the confidence of years spent turning disadvantage into victory. We make them come to us on our terms. Channel them into kill zones, use terrain to our advantage, force them to fight the kind of battle where numbers matter less than preparation. He looked around the room, meeting worried eyes with steady resolve. It will require everyone, men, women, even children old enough to carry messages or supplies. This isn't about warriors defeating raiders. It's about a community defending itself. The planning session lasted until nearly midnight. Leif found himself sliding back into familiar patterns, assessing defensive positions, calculating supply requirements, organizing responsibilities according to individual capabilities. But there was a difference this time. Instead of commanding soldiers, he was working with neighbors. Instead of imposing strategy, he was collaborating with people who knew their own land and limitations. Thyri appeared at his side as the meeting began to break up, carrying 2 cups of warm ale and wearing an expression he couldn't quite read. You've made your choice, she observed, settling beside him on the bench. Have I? Leif accepted the ale gratefully, suddenly aware of how exhausted he felt. I'm not sure what choice I've made, actually. You chose to protect home instead of seeking glory elsewhere. Her voice carried warmth and something deeper, pride, perhaps, or recognition. When Ragnar offered you a return to your old life, you were tempted because it was familiar. But when your village needed you, you didn't hesitate. Leif considered this, swirling ale in his cup while sorting through his own motivations. I'm still planning violence, still preparing for battle. How is that different from what I was before? Because this time you're fighting for something instead of against it. Thyri's hand found his arm, a touch that somehow steadied his scattered thoughts. Before, you were Leif, the warrior, defined by what you could destroy. Now you're becoming Leif the Protector, defined by what you can preserve. And if I have to kill those men tomorrow, then you'll carry that weight, she said simply. But you'll carry it for the right reasons. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the last villagers making their way home through darkened streets. Finally, Thyri spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something I need to tell you, about why my father and I really came to Hrafndal. Leif looked at her, noting the tension in her shoulders and the careful way she chose her words. We weren't just here for shipbuilding contracts, she continued. My father has been tracking the movements of raider groups throughout the northern territories. Several coastal settlements have reported similar encounters, small forces demanding tribute, establishing footholds, testing defenses. The implications hit Leif like a cold wave. You're saying this is coordinated? I'm saying someone is building an empire out of chaos, using Earl Magnus's death as cover to consolidate power through fear and force. Thyri met his eyes directly. My father thinks it's connected to the Danish king's expansionist ambitions, advance forces, preparing the way for larger invasions. Leif felt his blood chill as the larger picture became clear. If Thyri was right, Hrafndal wasn't facing simple raiders, they were confronting the advance guard of a much larger threat. And tomorrow's battle wouldn't just determine the fate of one village. It would be the opening move in a war that could reshape the entire northern territories. Why didn't you tell me sooner? He asked. Thyri's smile carried sadness and regret. Because I wanted you to choose this life for the right reasons. Not because duty demanded it, but because your heart did. As Leif walked home through the quiet village, her words echoed in his mind. Had he chosen? Or had circumstances simply swept him back into the role he'd tried so hard to escape? By dawn, he supposed, he would know the answer. Dawn came grey and cold, with mist rising from the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. Leif stood at his window, watching the raider ships bob at anchor while his mind ran through final preparations. The villagers had worked through the night, following his defensive plans, with the desperate efficiency of people who understood their lives hung in the balance. But something felt wrong. He'd positioned archers in concealed locations, prepared barricades to channel attackers into predetermined zones, and organized the non-combatants into support roles that would keep them safe while contributing to the defense. It was a sound strategy, one that should give the villagers a fighting chance against superior numbers and training. So why did every warrior instinct he possessed scream warnings? A knock at his door interrupted his brooding. He opened it to find Ragnar standing in the morning mist, travel-stained and grim-faced. "You came," Leif said, surprised despite himself. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Ragnar clasped his shoulder with familiar warmth. "When word reached me that raiders were threatening your village, honor demanded I ride to your aid. Whatever our disagreements about the future, you're still my shield, brother." Relief flooded through Leif as he realized he wouldn't have to face the coming battle alone. Ragnar's presence changed the tactical situation considerably. Two experienced warriors working together could accomplish far more than either could manage individually. "How many men did you bring?" Leif asked, already calculating how additional fighters might alter his defensive plans. "Just myself. I rode hard through the night to get here in time." Ragnar's expression grew troubled. "But Leif, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything." They walked together toward the harbor, where the raider ships waited in ominous silence. As they moved through the village, Leif noted his defensive preparations. With satisfaction, concealed positions looked properly hidden. Barricades appeared random, but would funnel attackers exactly where he wanted them. And the villagers moved with the focused determination of people who'd accepted the necessity of violence. "What aren't you telling me?" Leif asked as they reached the overlook that gave them a clear view of the harbor. Ragnar was quiet for a long moment, studying the enemy vessels with professional attention. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that made Leif's blood run cold. The raider leader, the one who threatened your village yesterday. His name is Gunnar the Red. Leif knew that name. Every warrior in the Northern Territories knew that name. Gunnar the Red was Earl Magnus's youngest son, the one who'd been passed over for inheritance in favor of his older brother Eric, the one who disappeared shortly after their father's funeral, taking a dozen loyal men with him. Eric's brother, Leif said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn like a terrible sunrise. More than that, Ragnar's jaw tightened. He's the one behind the territorial fragmentation. He's been systematically undermining his brother's claim to power, using Danish gold to fund raider groups throughout the region. Eric doesn't know. He thinks the threats are external, that foreign powers are taking advantage of our moment of weakness. The implications hit Leif like a physical blow. If Gunnar was behind the raider threat, then yesterday's confrontation hadn't been about simple tribute or territorial expansion. It had been about something far more personal and dangerous. He's testing me, Leif realized, seeing if I'll stand with his brother or remain neutral. Worse than that, Ragnar turned to face him directly. He knows about the War Council's offer. He knows they want me as war chief and you as my second. If he can eliminate you here, in front of witnesses, it accomplishes multiple goals, removes a potential threat, demonstrates his power, and sends a message to anyone considering resistance. Leif felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. That's why he chose Hrafndal. Not because it's strategically valuable, but because it's where I am. And that's not the worst part. Ragnar's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think he knew I'd come to help you. He's counting on it. The mist seemed to thicken around them as Leif processed this revelation. Everything he'd assumed about the coming battle was wrong. The raiders weren't here for tribute or territorial control. They were here for him. And if Ragnar was right, Gunnar had anticipated his defensive strategy and prepared accordingly. We need to evacuate the village, Leif said urgently. Get everyone to safety before... Too late. Ragnar pointed toward the harbor, where boats were already pushing off from the raider ships. They're coming. But something was different from what Leif had expected. Instead of the dozen men he'd seen yesterday, nearly 40 warriors were approaching the shore in disciplined formation. They moved with the precision of professional soldiers rather than casual raiders, and their equipment was far superior to what he'd observed during the initial confrontation. He was holding back yesterday, Leif realized, showing me just enough threat to trigger a defensive response, but not enough to reveal his true strength. Classic feint, Ragnar agreed grimly. Draw out your enemy's strategy, then counter it with overwhelming force. Leif's mind raced through alternatives. His defensive plan was designed around channeling a smaller force into prepared positions. Against 40 disciplined warriors, those same positions would become death traps for the defenders. The villagers would be slaughtered. The horn, he said suddenly. Signal the villagers to fall back to the secondary positions. But even as Ragnar moved toward the warning horn, Leif knew it was too late. The raiders were already landing, already moving with the swift efficiency of a well-rehearsed plan. They knew exactly where to strike, exactly how to avoid the defensive preparations, exactly where the villagers would be most vulnerable. Someone had told them. The realization hit him like ice water. There was a traitor in Hrafndal. Someone who'd observed his planning session, mapped his defensive positions, and passed the information to Gunnar's forces. But who? And why? Ragnar, he said urgently. We need to. He turned to find his oldest friend, pointing a sword at his chest. I'm sorry, Leif, Ragnar said, his voice heavy with genuine regret. But you were never going to accept the War Council's offer willingly. And the Northern Territories need your tactical mind more than this village needs your protection. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Leif stared at the man who'd saved his life, fought beside him through a dozen campaigns, and shared the bond that only warriors who'd faced death together could understand. You're working with Gunnar? I'm working for the future of our people, Ragnar corrected. Gunnar has the strength to unite the territories under single leadership. Eric is weak. indecisive, more concerned with diplomacy than defense. Under his rule, we'll be picked apart by enemies who understand that strength is the only currency that matters. And the villagers? The innocent people you're about to slaughter? Ragnar's expression hardened. Acceptable losses. You taught me that, remember? In war, you do what's necessary to achieve strategic objectives. Sentiment is a luxury commanders can't afford. Leif felt the words he'd spoken years ago come back to haunt him. How many times had he sacrificed good men for tactical advantage? How many times had he chosen victory over mercy? The man standing before him was a product of his own teaching, shaped by the hard necessities of a warrior's life. "This isn't war," Leif said quietly. "This is murder." "This is the beginning of a new age," Ragnar replied, "and you can choose to be part of it or die fighting against it. But either way, those villagers are forfeit. The only question is whether you'll join me in building something greater from the ashes." Around them, the sounds of battle began to echo through the village as Gunnar's forces struck with devastating precision. Leif could hear screams, the clash of weapons, the terrible sounds of a community under assault. Looking into Ragnar's eyes, Leif realized that the choice he'd been avoiding for 6 days had finally arrived. Not between war and peace. Not between glory and obscurity, but between the man he'd been and the man he needed to become. The question Thyri had asked him suddenly echoed in his mind with crystal clarity. You want wife or lonely life? But now he understood that she'd really been asking something deeper. Did he want to live for love or die for duty? Standing in the mist with his oldest friend's sword at his throat and his adopted village burning around him, Leif finally knew the answer. "I choose them," Leif said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite the blade at his throat. "Whatever the cost, I choose the people who've become my family over the power that made me empty." Ragnar's expression flickered with something that might have been respect before hardening into resignation. "Then you choose to die?" "Perhaps, but I choose to die as myself, not as your weapon." The words hung between them for a heartbeat before Leif moved with the lightning speed that had made him legendary. His hand swept up, deflecting Ragnar's thrust, while his other fist drove into his former friend's throat. Ragnar stumbled backward, gasping, and Leif used the moment to break free of sword range. "You were always too honorable for your own good." Ragnar wheezed, recovering his stance with professional efficiency. "That's why you could never see the larger picture. The larger picture doesn't require burning villages full of innocent people," Leif replied, circling carefully. He was unarmed, except for the eating knife at his belt, hardly adequate against Ragnar's war sword, but it would have to suffice until he could find better options. Around them, the sounds of battle grew closer. Leif could hear Magnus Ironbeard shouting orders, the clash of weapons against the hastily constructed barricades, and underneath it all, the terrified cries of people who'd never expected violence to find them in their peaceful home. "You trained me well," Ragnar said, advancing with measured steps. "I know all your moves, all your tricks. This doesn't have to be difficult." "You're right," Leif agreed, then dove sideways as Ragnar lunged forward. He rolled behind the stone well, where he'd sat with Thyri just days before, coming up with a loose cobblestone in his hand. "You do know my old tricks." The stone caught Ragnar across the temple with enough force to stagger him, and Leif used the opening to sprint toward his house. If he could reach his war axe, "Help! Someone help us!" The scream came from the direction of the market square, high-pitched with terror. A woman's voice, followed by the cruel laughter of men who enjoyed fear. Leif's step faltered as training warred with conscience. Ragnar was behind him, armed and dangerous. The smart tactical choice was to retrieve his weapons first, then engage the enemy from a position of strength. But that scream, he changed direction, abandoning his planned route to sprint toward the market square. Behind him, he heard Ragnar curse and give chase. The scene that greeted him was a nightmare of smoke and scattered goods. 3 raiders had cornered a group of villagers, mostly women and children, against the baker's shop. One of the attackers held Astrid by the hair, while another menaced young Bjorn with a blood-stained axe. The boy was trying to protect his mother and sister, brandishing his damaged practice sword with more courage than skill. Leif didn't hesitate. He snatched up a fallen merchant's staff and charged into the melee with a war cry that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The first raider turned just in time to catch the staff across his jaw with a sickening crack. The second barely managed to raise his shield before Leif's follow-up strike drove him to his knees. But the third raider was quick-thinking and ruthless. As Leif engaged his companions, the man pressed his knife to Astrid's throat and smiled coldly. "Stop right there, hero, or the baker's wife dies." Leif froze, staff raised for a killing blow that would never land. He could see the calculation in the raider's eyes, the professional assessment of angles and timing. This wasn't a panicked amateur, this was a killer who'd used human shields before. "Let her go," Leif said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command. "Your quarrel is with me, not her. My quarrel is with anyone who stands between me and profit," the raider replied. "Now drop the weapon," and Bjorn's damaged practice sword took him through the kidney from behind. The boy had circled around while the raider's attention was fixed on Leif, moving with the stealth his training had taught him. As the man collapsed, Bjorn helped his mother to safety with hands that shook but held steady. "Well done," Leif told him, pride warming his voice despite the chaos around them. "You taught me to look for openings," Bjorn replied, hefting his cracked blade. "What now, master?" Before Leif could answer, Ragnar emerged from the smoke with a dozen raiders at his back. His face was grim with purpose as he surveyed the scene, 3 of his men down, the hostages freed, and Leif standing protective guard over a group of terrified villagers. "Enough games," Ragnar declared. "Surrender now, and I'll ensure the survivors are treated well. Continue this futile resistance, and everyone dies." Leif looked around the market square, taking in the tactical situation with a professional eye. 12 against 1, with civilians to protect and no avenue of escape. By any reasonable calculation, this was the end. But reason had never been his strongest quality when people he cared about were in danger. "Magnus," he called toward the harbour, where fighting still raged around the defensive positions. "Sound the retreat, get everyone to the Great Hall." "Leif, no!" The response came not from Magnus, but from Thyri, who emerged from behind the baker's shop with determination blazing in her green eyes. She carried bow with an arrow already nocked, and her stance spoke of someone who knew how to use it. "Run," he told her urgently. "This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." She drew back the bowstring with smooth precision. "It became my fight the moment they threatened my home." Her arrow took one of Ragnar's men through the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into a merchant's stall. The remaining raiders spread out instinctively, seeking cover while reassessing the threat. "Touching," Ragnar said dryly, "but ultimately pointless. You're outnumbered and outmatched." "Maybe," Leif agreed, "but we're fighting for something worth dying for. That makes a difference." As if summoned by his words, more villagers began emerging from concealment. Eric Hammerhand appeared with a warhammer that had seen better days but still looked capable of crushing skulls. Sven the merchant materialized with a crossbow and the steady nerves of a man who'd faced danger in foreign ports. Magnus, Ironbeard, limped into view with blood on his sword and fire in his eyes. One by one, they came farmers with pitchforks, fishermen with boat hooks, merchants with trade knives. None of them were professional warriors, but they moved with the unified purpose of people defending their home and families. They were afraid, but they were there. "You see," Leif said, raising his voice so all could hear. "This is what you're really fighting, Ragnar. Not me, not some legendary warrior from old stories. You're fighting a community. people who choose to stand together rather than kneel separately. Ragnar's expression flickered with something that might have been doubt, but his voice remained steady. Communities can be broken. I've seen it done. Not this one, Thyri said firmly, moving to stand beside Leif. Not our home. The standoff stretched taut as both sides measured distances, calculated odds, and prepared for the violence that seemed inevitable. But in that moment of suspended time, Leif felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, fighting for exactly the right reasons. Behind him, young Bjorn whispered a question. "Master Leif, are we going to win?" Leif looked around at the faces surrounding him, ordinary people transformed by extraordinary circumstances into something magnificent. Thyri, with her warrior's stance and unshakable resolve. Magnus bleeding but unbowed. Eric gripping his hammer like he meant to reshape the world. Sven calm and deadly as any professional soldier, his people, his family, his choice. "Yes," he said simply. "We're going to win." Ragnar heard the conviction in those words and saw something in Leif's eyes that made him step back involuntarily. This wasn't the calculated confidence of a tactical commander or the desperate bravado of a cornered man. This was the absolute certainty of someone who'd finally found something worth more than survival. "Attack!" Ragnar commanded his men, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. As the raiders charged forward with weapons raised and battle cries echoing off the buildings, Leif felt time slow to the crystalline clarity he'd always experienced in moments of ultimate danger. Every detail burned into his awareness, the sound of Thyri's bowstring, the rhythm of approaching footsteps, the weight of the staff in his hands. But most of all, he felt the presence of the people fighting beside him, their courage feeding his own until he no longer felt like a single warrior facing impossible odds. He felt like part of something larger, something unbreakable, something worth preserving at any cost. The legend of Leif Oxenhart was about to end. The story of Leif the Protector was about to begin. The battle erupted with the fury of a thunderstorm breaking over the mountains. Leif met the first raider's charge with the merchant's staff, deflecting a sword thrust and following through with a strike that shattered the man's collarbone. Around him, the villagers fought with the desperate courage of people protecting everything they held dear. Thyri's arrows found their marks with lethal precision, each shot carefully placed to disable rather than kill when possible. She moved like a dancer between positions, never staying in one place long enough for the raiders to target her effectively. Sven's crossbow spoke with the steady rhythm of a man who understood patience, while Eric Hammerhand lived up to his name by crushing anything that came within reach of his massive weapon. But it was Magnus Ironbeard who surprised everyone. The aging diplomat fought with the skill of a man who'd been downplaying his abilities for years, his swordwork economical and deadly as he carved through raiders with surgical precision. "Behind you!" Bjorn's warning came just in time for Leif to duck under a swing that would have taken his head off. He spun and drove the staff's iron-shod tip into the attacker's stomach, doubling the man over before finishing him with a knee to the face. The villagers were holding their own better than any reasonable person could have expected, but the raiders were professional killers with superior equipment and training. Slowly, inevitably, the defensive circle began to contract as the defenders fell back under pressure. Leif found himself fighting beside Eric Hammerhand as three raiders coordinated their attack, trying to overwhelm the big blacksmith through sheer numbers. Eric's hammer sang through the air, keeping two of them at bay, but the third managed to slip past his guard with a dagger aimed at his ribs. Leif intercepted the blade with his staff, the impact jarring both weapons from their wielders' hands. Before the raider could recover, Eric's massive fist caught him in the temple and dropped him like a felled tree. "Thanks," Eric panted, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. "Thank me when we're still alive tomorrow," Leif replied, scooping up the fallen raider's sword. The weight felt familiar in his hand, awakening muscle memories that had been dormant for 3 years. Across the battlefield, he could see Ragnar carving his way toward them with methodical efficiency. His former friend moved like the master swordsman he'd always been, dispatching anyone foolish enough to challenge him while keeping his eyes fixed on Leif. "We need to fall back," Magnus called out, his voice strained with effort. "Regroup at the Great Hall." But Leif could see the tactical situation clearly. If they retreated now, they'd be running while exhausted and demoralized. The raiders would pick them off one by one during the withdrawal. Better to make their stand here, where at least they had some cover and could support each other. "No," he called back. "We hold here." Thyri appeared at his side, her quiver nearly empty but her resolve unshaken. "How long can we last?" "As long as we need to," Leif said, though. Privately, he knew their situation was becoming desperate. They'd taken down nearly half the raiders, but the survivors were the most experienced and dangerous. Meanwhile, his own people were tiring, and several sported wounds that would slow them in the continuing fight. That was when he heard the horn. A deep, resonant call that echoed across the harbour and through the village streets, not the warning horn they'd prepared for the defence, but something deeper and more authoritative. The sound of reinforcements arriving. Ragnar heard it too, and for the first time since the battle began, uncertainty flickered across his features. He raised his own horn and sounded a different call, a retreat signal that his men obeyed with the instant discipline of professional soldiers. "This isn't over," Ragnar called to Leif as the raiders began withdrawing toward the harbour. "You've won a battle, not the war." "Then we'll fight the war too," Leif replied, raising his captured sword in salute, "as many times as it takes." As the raiders retreated, new figures began emerging from the forest paths that led inland from Hrafndal. Armed men, wearing the colours of several different clans, moving with the coordinated precision of an organized force. At their head rode a figure Leif recognized with profound relief, Erik Magnusson, the rightful heir to his father's territories. "Leif Oxenhart," Erik called out as he dismounted near the market square. "When word reached us that raiders were threatening peaceful villages, I knew we'd find you in the thick of things." "Erik." Leif clasped the younger man's arm, noting the new authority in his bearing. The uncertainty that had marked him after his father's death seemed to have been burned away by necessity and responsibility. "You came at the right time. My scouts have been tracking raider movements for weeks. When they reported a large force moving against Hrafndal, I gathered what men I could and rode hard." Erik's eyes swept the battlefield, taking in the scattered bodies and the exhausted but victorious villagers. "Though it looks like you managed well enough without us." Around them, the people of Hrafndal began emerging from hiding places, checking on wounded neighbours and beginning the grim task of counting their losses. The immediate battle was over, but everyone understood that larger conflicts lay ahead. But the fight wasn't finished yet. Even as Erik's reinforcements secured the village centre, shouts erupted from the harbour, where Ragnar's men were attempting to reach their ships. A running battle had developed along the waterfront as some of the raiders found their retreat cut off by Erik's cavalry. "They're trying to burn the ships," Thyri called out, pointing toward the harbour where smoke was beginning to rise from the fishing fleet. If Ragnar couldn't escape by sea, he was apparently determined to ensure that Hrafndal paid a price for its resistance. Leif didn't hesitate. "Erik, secure the village. Make sure everyone's accounted for." He was already running toward the harbour, sword in hand, and fury driving him forward. Behind him, he heard Thyri's footsteps and turned to see her following, with bow in hand and determination on her face. "Stay here," he commanded. "It's too dangerous." "I told you before," she replied, not breaking stride. "This became my fight when they threatened our home. There was no time to argue." Together, they sprinted through the village streets toward the sounds of combat, passing overturned carts and scattered goods from the morning's interrupted market day. The smell of smoke grew stronger with each step. At the harbour, chaos reigned. Ragnar had positioned his remaining men in a defensive line, while several raiders worked frantically to set fire to every boat they could reach. The fishing fleet that represented Hrafndal's livelihood was going up in flames, and the merchant vessels that brought prosperity to the village wouldn't be far behind. "We need to reach the fire crews before the whole harbour burns," Leif said, assessing the tactical situation. Ragnar had chosen his position well. Anyone trying to fight the fires would be exposed to his archers, but the defenders couldn't simply wait for reinforcements while their economic foundation turned to ash. "I can provide covering fire," Thyri said, nocking an arrow. "But I'm down to my last few shafts. Then we make them count." Leif burst from cover with the speed that had made him legendary, zigzagging between obstacles to confuse the enemy archers. Thyri's bowstring sang behind him, and he heard a raider cry out in pain as her arrow found its mark. He reached the first burning boat and began hauling water buckets, working frantically to contain the flames while maintaining enough awareness to dodge the crossbow bolts that occasionally whistled past his head. But it was a losing battle. For every fire he managed to suppress, two more seemed to spring up. Ragnar's men were too well positioned, and there were too few defenders to both fight the blazes and engage the enemy. That's when unexpected help arrived. Young Bjorn appeared beside him with a bucket of water, followed by his mother Astrid and a growing crowd of villagers who decided that saving their harbour was worth the risk. They formed a bucket brigade that stretched from the wells to the waterfront, passing containers hand to hand, while Thyri and a handful of other archers provided what covering fire they could. "Get down!" Leif shouted as a flight of crossbow bolts arced toward the bucket line. The villagers scattered, taking cover behind overturned carts and piles of fishing nets, but they didn't retreat. As soon as the volley passed, they were back to their water buckets with grim determination. Ragnar, seeing his strategy failing, abandoned his defensive position and charged directly toward Leif with his sword raised for a killing blow. This was what the confrontation had always been building toward, the final test between former friends who'd chosen different paths. They met in the space between burning boats, their blades ringing like bells as skill matched against skill. Ragnar was as fast and deadly as ever, but Leif fought with something his opponent couldn't match: the absolute conviction that came from protecting home and family. "You could have been great," Ragnar panted as they circled each other, looking for openings. "You could have shaped the future of the Northern Territories. Instead, you chose to waste your talents on these sheep." "These sheep just drove off your professional raiders," Leif pointed out, parrying a thrust aimed at his heart. "What does that make you?" Ragnar's face darkened with rage, and his attacks became more aggressive, more reckless. He was the superior swordsman in pure technique, but anger made him predictable. When he overextended on a particularly vicious swing, Leif stepped inside his protectorson, guard, and drove the pommel of his sword into Ragnar's temple. His former friend crumpled to the dock, alive but unconscious. Around them, the remaining raiders threw down their weapons as Eric's reinforcements completed their encirclement. The battle was over, but as Leif looked around at the smoking ruins of the harbour, the wounded villagers, and the frightened faces of people who'd never expected violence to find them in their peaceful home, he realized that victory felt nothing like he'd remembered. There was no glory here, no sense of triumph, only the grim satisfaction of having protected what mattered most. Thyri appeared at his side, her hand finding his arm in a gesture that somehow steadied his scattered thoughts. "It's finished," she said softly. Leif nodded, letting his sword fall to his side. "Yes," he agreed. "One way of living is finished. Now we find out what comes next." 3 months later, Leif stood in his workshop, putting the finishing touches on a duis, ceremonial sword commissioned by Erik Magnusson himself. The blade gleamed with the kind of perfection that came from patience and skill working in harmony. Its edge keen enough to split silk, yet balanced beautifully for both ceremony and combat. Outside his window, the sounds of reconstruction filled the air, hammers ringing as new roofs went up, voices calling to each other as neighbors collaborated on repairs, and underneath it all, the deeper rhythm of a community, rebuilding itself stronger than before. The harbour had been restored, the damaged ships repaired or replaced, and trade had resumed with a vigour that spoke of resilience rather than mere recovery. "Beautiful work," said a familiar voice behind him. Leif turned to find Thyri in his doorway, carrying a basket of fresh bread and wearing a smile that never failed to warm something deep in his chest. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened from friendship to something far more profound, not the passionate romance of youthful tales, but the steady, comfortable love of two people who'd chosen each other with full knowledge of what that choice meant. "Eric's commission?" she asked, admiring the sword. "The last piece." Leif set down his polishing cloth and wiped his hands clean. "After this, I think I'm done making weapons. What will you make instead?" It was a question they'd discussed many times over the winter months, as Leif had slowly discovered that his skills with metal could serve purposes far beyond violence. He'd crafted plowshares that turned earth more efficiently than anything the farmers had used before, ship fittings that made vessels faster and more seaworthy, and tools that made every kind of work easier and more precise. "Whatever people need," he said simply. "Whatever makes their lives better." Thyri nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for explanation. This was what peace looked like, not the absence of conflict, but the presence of purpose, that served life rather than death. "Eric sent a message," she said, settling on the stool where she'd spent countless hours keeping him company while he worked. "The Northern Territories are officially united under his leadership. The clan leaders have accepted him as Earl, and the Danish threat has been neutralized." Leif wasn't surprised. Eric had proven himself during the crisis, showing the kind of steady leadership his father would have been proud of. More importantly, he'd learned to surround himself with advisors who valued wisdom over warfare, diplomacy over domination. "What about Ragnar?" Leif asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Exile," Thyri replied, "stripped of lands and titles, forbidden from returning to the Northern Territories. Eric said it was a mercy he granted because of your request for clemency." Leif nodded slowly. Ragnar had made his choices, just as Leif had made his. The exile was just perhaps more merciful than his former. Friend deserved, but justice served mercy better than revenge, and Gunnar the Red, dead, killed, trying to escape when the Danish fleet abandoned him. Thyri's voice carried no satisfaction, only the weary acknowledgement that some conflicts could only end one way. His surviving followers have been absorbed into Eric's forces or scattered to the winds. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the workshop windows. Outside, young Bjorn's voice could be heard directing a group of children in some elaborate game that involved wooden swords and a great deal of enthusiastic shouting. "He's been asking when you'll resume training sessions," Thyri observed with amusement. "Soon," Leif promised. "But the focus will be different. Defense, not offense. Protection, not conquest." He smiled at the sounds of childhood games. "Though I suspect he's learning more from playing than he ever did from formal drills." "Perhaps that's true of all of us," Thyri said softly. As evening approached, they walked together through the village toward the great hall where Magnus Ironbeard was hosting one of his regular community feasts. These gatherings had become more frequent since the battle, as if the shared danger had awakened everyone to the value of connection and celebration. The hall was warm with firelight and filled with the voices of people who'd chosen to build rather than destroy, to protect rather than conquer, to love rather than fear. Leif found himself surrounded by faces he knew as well as family. Eric Hammerhand, discussing a new commission, Magnus Ironbeard planning improvements to the harbour defences, Sven the merchant sharing tales from his recent trading voyages. "Leif," Magnus called out, raising his ale cup, "a toast to the man who taught us that the strongest defence comes from people willing to stand together." The hall erupted in cheers and raised cups, but Leif felt a moment of discomfort with the attention. He was about to deflect the praise when Thyri's hand found his arm, steadying him with her touch. "Accept it," she whispered. "They're not honoring the warrior you were. They're celebrating the protector you became." So he raised his own cup and acknowledged their gratitude, though in his heart he knew the real heroes were the ordinary people who'd chosen courage when it mattered most. Later, as they walked home under stars that seemed brighter than they'd been in years, Thyri asked the question that had started everything. "So," she said with mischief in her voice, "you want wife or lonely life?" Leif stopped walking and turned to face her fully, seeing in her eyes the same bold honesty that had first challenged him to examine his choices. But now her question carried layers of meaning that went far beyond simple companionship. It was about choosing hope over despair, connection over isolation, love over the safety of emotional armor. "I want the life we're building together," he said, taking her hands in his, "whatever that becomes." Her smile was radiant as starlight. "Then let's go build it." And together they walked toward the future they'd chosen, not the one circumstances had demanded, but the one their hearts had discovered was possible. Behind them, the village of Hrafndal settled into peaceful sleep, protected by the quiet strength of people who'd learned that the greatest victories came not from conquering enemies, but from choosing to become worthy of the love they'd found.